What if the difference between a safe landing and a catastrophic crash came down to a single, silent switch, left untouched in a storm-tossed cockpit? This simple oversight would culminate in one of the most tragic accidents in American aviation history, revealing critical flaws in procedures and human factors that would forever change airline safety protocols. The story we're about to unravel serves as a sobering reminder that even the most experienced professionals can fall victim to a cascade of errors when multiple pressures converge. This is the story of American Airlines Flight 1420, a routine trip from Dallas to Little Rock that ended in fire and tragedy on a rain-lashed runway. But to truly understand this disaster, we must begin not in Arkansas, but hours earlier and miles away, inside the minds of two highly skilled pilots. The date was June 1, 1999, at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport. Captain Richard Bushman and First Officer Michael Aragal were running late. Their aircraft, an MD-82, had landed 40 minutes behind schedule, a delay caused by the same line of violent thunderstorms that now painted the radar screens a threatening red. For Bushman and Aragal, this was the final leg of a long day that had started in Chicago, a grinding sequence of takeoffs and landings that was about to reach its stressful climax. The accumulating fatigue of their extended duty period would become a crucial factor in the events about to unfold, impairing judgment and reaction times at the most critical moments. The crew of Flight 1420 were not the stereotypical reckless aviators often depicted in disaster summaries. In fact, they were the opposite. Captain Bushman was a 48-year-old former Air Force lieutenant colonel, a pilot with over 10,000 hours of experience. His record was so impeccable that American Airlines had made him a check airman on the MD-80, tasked with evaluating and certifying other pilots. His colleagues described him as a leader with sharp instincts and a calm demeanor under pressure. He was, by all accounts, the man you would want in the left seat during a crisis. Throughout his career, Bushman had demonstrated exceptional skill in handling emergency situations, having previously successfully managed multiple mechanical failures and weather diversions without incident. First Officer Aragal was equally proficient. At 35, he was a seasoned aviator who had cut his teeth in the U.S. Navy before moving to corporate aviation and finally achieving his goal of flying for a major airline. He was described as knowledgeable and confident, an above-average new hire who had already impressed his seniors. His military background had instilled in him strict discipline and procedural adherence, qualities that made his subsequent actions even more puzzling to investigators. So, with such a capable team at the controls, what chain of events could possibly lead them to ruin? The answer lies in a perfect storm of pressure, fatigue, and a critical last-minute lapse that would expose vulnerabilities in even the most robust training systems. The operational pressure was mounting by the minute. At the gate, First Officer Aragal made a crucial call to airline dispatch. He warned them that they had a hard deadline of firm departure no later than 11:15 p.m., or they would legally exceed their 14-hour duty day and the flight would be cancelled. He even suggested proactively finding a replacement aircraft or scrubbing the flight altogether. This was a clear-eyed assessment of a deteriorating situation. But the machinery of a major airline is slow to stop. Instead of cancelling, dispatch found a substitute MD-82, and the boarding process for the 139 passengers and 6 crew members began. The plane was a 17-year-old workhorse, a model American Airlines relied on for hundreds of daily domestic flights. It was safe, reliable, and, tonight, would be pushed to its limits. The aircraft, registration N215AA, had undergone all required maintenance checks and was considered airworthy in every respect. Finally, over 2 hours behind schedule, Flight 1420 departed Dallas. The pilots were undoubtedly feeling the strain of a long day, compounded by the urgency to get their passengers and themselves to their destination. En route, a message from the flight dispatcher crackled through the data link: expedite to Little Rock to beat thunderstorms. The pressure was now officially codified, yet remarkably, the cockpit voice recorder reveals a calm, even lighthearted atmosphere at this point. Aragal commented on a bright light outside, joking, "There's a moon out there or a spaceship." Bushman replied with a casual, "Yeah." This professional camaraderie would soon be tested as conditions deteriorated rapidly. This brief moment of levity would stand in stark contrast to the tension that would soon grip the cockpit. Then, the first major warning arrived. Air traffic control broadcast a severe thunderstorm warning for the Little Rock area. Thunderstorms are minefields for aircraft, packed with wind, shear, hail, and violent updrafts. But the crew pressed on. As they began their descent into Little Rock National Airport, the controller's voice introduced a new layer of tension. He reported winds gusting to 44 knots, about 50 miles per hour, and thunderstorms closing in from the northwest. Aragal, handling the radios, replied that they could see the lightning flashing in the distance. The electrical activity illuminated the cockpit intermittently, creating a strobe-like effect that added to the growing sense of unease. The controller initially vectored them for an approach to runway 22L, but the wind was howling almost directly across the runway, creating a dangerous crosswind. This sparked a technical discussion between the two pilots. Captain Bushman stated the crosswind limit for a wet runway was 20 knots. First Officer Erigel thought it was 25. Bushman was correct. But this critical safety discussion was left hanging, unresolved, as the wind gusts were already double the legal limit. It was the first of many warnings that would be mentally noted, then set aside. This pattern of recognizing hazards but failing to act upon them would become a recurring and fatal theme throughout the approach. The controller, peering at his old black and white radar display in the tower, grew concerned. He told the pilots his screen looked much worse than their modern color-equipped cockpit radar. He offered them a visual approach, but with clouds intermittently obscuring the runway. Erigel wisely requested radar vectors instead. Then, the controller issued the dreaded phrase, "Winds here alert." Winds here is a pilot's nightmare on approach, a sudden violent shift in wind speed or direction that can rob an aircraft of lift at the most critical moment. The pressure in the cockpit was now palpable, a physical weight. Multiple studies have shown that winds here accidents have a significantly higher fatality rate than other weather-related incidents, a fact both pilots would have known well. Amidst this chaos, the wind changed direction. Captain Bushman, seeking to land into the wind for better control, requested a switch to the opposite direction runway for R. This last-minute change, while logically sound, added a new layer of cognitive workload for the already tired crew. They now had to reconfigure their approach, reprogram their navigation systems, and complete new checklists, all while wrestling with the aircraft in brutal turbulence. The mental capacity required for these tasks under such conditions would stretch their resources to the breaking point. The controller cleared them for a visual approach to runway 4R, but the visual approach became a cruel joke. Erigel spotted the runway lights, but Bushman, fighting the controls, could not see. "We're losing it," Bushman said, his frustration evident. "I don't think we can maintain visual." A cloud swept between them and the airport, forcing them to abandon the visual approach and return to instrument guidance. The captain's unease was now vocal. "I hate running around visual at night and weather without having some clue where I am," he confessed. Erigel's reply was telling. "Yeah, but the longer we go out here, ... double quotes." Bushman cut him off. "Yeah, I know." This exchange reveals a shared, unspoken determination to land a psychological trap known as get-there-itis that was closing around them. This phenomenon, well documented in aviation safety literature, describes the dangerous fixation on reaching a destination despite deteriorating conditions. The storm was now consuming them. As they flew into a wall of water, Bushman exclaimed, "Oh, we're going right into this." At that exact moment, the controller reported heavy rain had slashed runway visibility to less than 3,000 feet. The stress was peaking. The controller then gave another wind update, 30 knots, gusting to 45. Erigel read back the information incorrectly, but the specific number was almost irrelevant. The wind was far beyond any safe operating limit. Yet, incredibly, the pilots did not discuss this. Instead, they fixated on the visibility, with Bushman questioning if 3,000 feet was sufficient, and Erigel correcting him that their minimum was 2,400. They were now microscopically focused on technicalities, willfully ignoring the overwhelming macro-level danger. This cognitive tunneling, where attention narrows to specific details while missing the bigger picture, is a common effect of fatigue and high workload. The final minutes of the approach were a portrait of a cockpit in breakdown. The controller issued another "winds here" alert and repeated the extreme winds. No response from the crew. He then reported visibility had dropped further to 1,600 feet, well below their own stated minimum. Again, they ignored it. Checklists were being rushed or skipped. Communication became terse and fragmented. About 2 minutes from landing, Erigel asked, 140 flaps, and Bushman responded, "Yeah, I thought I called it." The formal, disciplined command response of a normal cockpit was gone. The carefully constructed safety barriers of commercial aviation were crumbling under the weight of exhaustion and pressure. Then, Captain Bushman uttered a phrase that should have been the final, blaring alarm to abort. As he fought the controls, he said, "This is a can of worms." In any other context, this admission of overwhelming complexity would have triggered an immediate go-around, but the momentum was too great. The goal of landing had become an obsession. The psychological investment in continuing had surpassed rational risk assessment, a dangerous threshold that experienced pilots are trained to recognize but in this case failed to identify. With less than a minute to go, the runway lights finally appeared through the torrential rain. Bushman called for the windshield wipers and took over visual flying. What happened next was a violent, chaotic blur. The MD-82 hit the runway hard, its main landing gear slamming onto the wet pavement while the plane was still not fully aligned. It landed in a crabbed position, and the moment it touched down it began a sickening slide. The aircraft's tail struck the runway first, followed by a series of severe bounces that would have terrified passengers and crew alike. Captain Bushman reacted instantly, deploying the thrust reversers at high power and stomping on the brakes. But in his urgency, the high-power reverse setting blocked airflow over the rudder, reducing his ability to steer. The aircraft, weighed down by its fuel and passengers, was not slowing down. It hydroplaned on the water-soaked runway, its brakes largely ineffective. For 25 terrifying seconds, the pilots fought a losing battle, the runway lights streaking past until, with a final horrifying lurch, the plane slid off the end of the concrete at over 100 miles per hour. Later analysis would show that even with maximum braking, stopping would have been marginal, but without spoiler deployment, it became mathematically impossible. It slammed into a metal approach light structure, a sturdy gantry built to hold runway lights. This object acted like a giant can opener, shearing through the cockpit and the left side of the fuselage. The impact was instantly fatal for Captain Bushman and 2 passengers seated in the first-class section. The aircraft ruptured into 3 main pieces and skidded to a halt in the darkness. Then, the final horror fire erupted in the torn-apart rear section of the cabin. The rupture of fuel lines combined with electrical shorts created the perfect conditions for a post-crash fire that would claim additional lives. In the aftermath, chaos and heroism intermingled. In the smoke-filled cabin, most passengers managed to escape through the overwing exits and giant gashes in the fuselage. Tragically, 4 passengers were overcome by toxic smoke before they could escape. In the shattered cockpit, First Officer Aragal was alive but trapped, his leg shattered. In a surreal moment of modern tragedy, he used his cell phone to first call American Airlines to report the crash, and then to call his wife, all while pinned in the wreckage awaiting rescue. His calmness in this extreme situation likely helped coordinate the initial emergency response. The emergency response was critically delayed. The air traffic controller, in the confusion, had not specified where along the long runway the crash had occurred. It took firefighters 18 long minutes to find the wreckage. They eventually doused the flames and pulled the survivors to safety. Aragal was the last to be freed, after a grueling 90-minute extraction operation. When the final accounting was done, 11 people had lost their lives. The tragedy was particularly poignant because it occurred at the very destination the crew had worked so desperately to reach. The investigation by the National Transportation Safety Board quickly identified the primary mechanical cause. The spoilers, also called speed brakes, had never been deployed. These are panels on the wings that pop up on landing. They do 2 vital jobs. They create drag to slow the plane down, and, crucially, they spoil the lift generated by the wings, forcing the aircraft's weight onto the landing gear. This makes the brakes tremendously more effective. On a wet runway without spoilers, an airplane is essentially still flying. Its weight isn't on the wheels, so braking is minimal. The investigators found that the crew, in their frenzied workload, had never armed the spoiler system. It was the single, silent, unchecked box. Subsequent testing demonstrated that with proper spoiler deployment, the aircraft would have stopped with hundreds of feet of runway remaining. But the deeper question remained: why? How could 2 exemplary pilots forget such a fundamental item? The answer is a devastating lesson in human factors. The crew was severely fatigued, having been on duty for over 16 hours. Their circadian rhythms were demanding sleep, not the complex decision-making required for a stormy night landing. They were also victims of intense self-imposed and operational pressure to get there. A famous MIT study at the time found that 90% of pilots will continue an approach into a thunderstorm if they are running late, a stunning statistic that reveals a universal human bias. This tendency to complete a mission despite changing conditions is not limited to aviation but appears across many high-stakes professions. The combination of fatigue, pressure, and a high-stress dynamic environment caused a catastrophic breakdown in their disciplined cockpit procedures. They missed multiple cues, ignored repeated safety limits, and skipped vital checklist items. Their once-calm cockpit degraded into a chaotic, task-saturated space where a fatal mistake became almost inevitable. The NTSB concluded that the accident was not the result of a single error, but rather a sequence of at least 7 distinct failures that compounded into disaster. The legacy of Flight 1420 is written in the safety protocols that followed. American Airlines and the aviation industry worldwide learned hard lessons. Training now emphasizes the sterile cockpit rule below 10,000 feet with renewed vigor. Procedures for go-arounds were strengthened, making it a mandatory non-punitive decision. Strict new limits on pilot duty times were implemented to combat fatigue. And now, on approach, both pilots are required to verbally confirm critical actions like spoiler arming, creating a system of double-checking that guards against a single lapse. This tragic crash was the last fatal weather-related accident for a major U.S. airline, a somber milestone that underscores how tragedy can forge a safer future. The implementation of advanced ground proximity warning systems and enhanced wind shear detection equipment can also trace their widespread adoption to lessons learned from this and similar accidents. If this deep dive into the crucial intersection of human psychology and mechanical procedure resonated with you, please support this channel by liking this video and subscribing to Winds of Thought. We explore the stories behind the headlines, uncovering the lessons history has to teach us. Let us know in the comments. In your own life, have you ever felt the pressure to get there leading you to overlook a critical step? Your experiences might help others recognize similar patterns in their own decision-making processes. The story of Flight 1420 reminds us that safety is a continuous journey, not a destination. and requires constant vigilance against the very human tendencies that can lead us astray even with the best training and intentions.